Hi folks, Canadian Prepper here. Guys, I have a very interesting table of statistics that I have personally compiled for you so that we can do a side-by-side analysis of who is the superior economic and military power and which one of these countries is more economically robust moving forward after this whole house of fiat cards collapses. So we have on the one hand, Russia and the United States. It's important for preparedness that we have an accurate worldview. We have an accurate understanding of what is going on in the world, because that is really half the battle. Knowledge is power. Now, so I've compiled this table. I will post this in the description section below. So as you can see, debt, Russia, $0.41 trillion worth of debt. Now, Russia has about less than half the population of the United States, so obviously their debt should be lower. But look at this number here, $28.4 trillion. This is all money that needs to be paid. You know what this is? That's all labor that people are going to have to do. This is all debt that is owed. Okay, so Russia, 0.41 trillion, the United States, 28.4 trillion. I can't remember the exact proportion, but I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 75,000 per person. That's not including average household debt, individual debt, all of the derivatives, and just all of the debt that's kind of built around the fiat system. So this is just the government, federal debt, okay? So that right there should give you a sense of true wealth, because when you have to factor this in, that this must be deducted off of whatever assessment of prosperity you're giving a nation, the amount of debt. This is why I'm always very skeptical about GDP as being an accurate measure of a country's wealth, because all of the infrastructure that has been built throughout the United States and many wealthy countries around the world is still being paid off. Like this 28 trillion, that's what all of that is. All those fancy roads and skyscrapers and stuff like that, that's what it is, okay? In terms of resource wealth, 75 trillion, supposedly, and not all of Russia has been surveyed, I highly doubt, because it's just a vast land, versus 45 trillion for the USA. So right there, you have a fraction of the debt, and you have nearly, not quite twice as much potential resource wealth in the ground to be extracted with half the population, okay? Oil reserves. This is, of course, going to be included within this, but I thought I would lay this out for you. So for crude oil, Russia has about 80 billion barrels. For shale oil, they have 74 billion barrels. The United States has about 35 billion barrels of crude and 76 billion barrels of shale oil. And I doubt that the Russian shale oil has all been discovered. I don't even think they're really tapping into that just yet, because of course it's still pretty costly. In terms of natural gas, 1,600 trillion, okay, I think this is cubic feet, versus 322 trillion cubic feet. This is nearly 5 times the amount of energy as the United States, with half the population, a fraction of the debt. Okay, it's important to keep this in mind as we move forward here. Gold, almost twice the amount of gold in the ground, almost twice the amount of proven reserves. Now, it is true that the United States has about twice the amount of gold, supposedly, in Fort Knox and other places. However, that is debatable. But in terms of gold per capita, they're about at parity with Russia. If not, Russia is a little bit ahead in terms of gold per capita. So this is important, because when the whole house of cards collapses, this is what's going to have the most value. So Russia is in a pretty good position in terms of how much gold they have in the ground. Now, these numbers are kind of suspect, okay? Because polling is always, it's very seldom statistically sound. Now, in the States, you could argue it's a bit more objective in terms of how the surveys are conducted. Now, I've heard as high as 85%. I just put 70%, conservatively speaking, people who support Vladimir Putin. This is off Statista. So you can see as the war started, after the war started in March 22, the approval rating went up to 83%. So we're just saying 70%. So that, for me, is an indicator of government stability. Now, some people would argue with that. Just because you have a 90% approval rating doesn't mean that your political system is going to be free from potential upheaval and collapse. In fact, it could, the pendulum could swing hard the other way. The well-balanced system that the United States has in terms of, left versus right, in some ways, even though it's very divided, can also act as a nice counterbalance and keep things at an equilibrium. So these numbers are somewhat misleading, but what this means is that the overwhelming majority of people support the current guy in power, i.e. Vladimir Putin, whereas with Joe Biden, at least currently, and I think it's actually probably a bit lower than this, obviously it fluctuates from week to week, 42%. Healthcare. Apparently it's free there. If you guys have different information, this was one I wasn't entirely sure when I was doing my research, but apparently healthcare for the most part is free. And of course, big question marks there because we all know it's not entirely free. This next one I'm not too sure about too. I'm not sure what the literacy level is in some of the more northern, far off nether regions of Russia, but supposedly it's 99% versus 88%, obviously nearly twice the landmass as the United States. However, the United States has more diverse biomes. They have Hawaii, they have more tropical regions, places that are perhaps more fertile for growing, different types, a different variety of fruits, more biodiversity, that sort of thing. In terms of fresh water, Russia obviously wins by almost 50%. In terms of nukes, rather negligible, although many people would say, nuclear experts in particular, that Russia's strategic nuclear capability is superior, as well as their missile defense. However, in all other aspects, the US military appears to be superior. In terms of taxation, roughly 12 plus or minus percent of your income goes to taxes, whereas in the United States, it's around 20%. The cost of living, it's good if this number is lower. However, we also have to keep in mind that there is a standard of living thing there, access to fresh water, how far you have to go to see a doctor, that sort of thing. But right now it's 100th. So they have one of the best costs of living. And this one, again, some of these statistics, and if there is corrections that need to be made, I will post it in the description and a pinned comment. 36.9th, so much higher cost of living. And if you live in one of those, like New York or LA or something like that, you know what that's about. Imports. This one is very important because this is how dependent the country is on globalization. So 2.5 million, I'm not sure what that is, dollars per imports for 1,000 people. This is 7.63 million in the United States. So nearly 3 times more dependent on globalization. This is a result of sanctions. Okay, when you're living under sanctions, you have to learn to do things for yourself. That's why in the great decoupling that we are seeing, Russia, by some people's standards, has a little bit of an advantage when it comes to the more rudimentary forms of technology that they already have the industrial base to create themselves. Energy imports, clearly a huge difference there. Russia virtually needs to import no energy whatsoever, 3 billion versus 72 billion. Drug deaths, I know the drug system in Russia is a bit more strict. They did have a big drug problem at one point. And again, you might want to do a little bit of research on those statistics, but apparently drug-related deaths per 1,000 people is much higher in the United States. Obviously, obesity, a big problem in the United States. Another statistics I don't have here is pharmaceutical drug addiction, pharmaceutical drug dependency, as well as psychopharmaceutical drug dependency. So we see the obesity is about 50% higher. The household debt to GDP ratio is much higher in the United States. Okay, this is very important to keep in mind, that you might think that you are wealthier than a country who might have a lower standard of living, but it's all based on your ability to pay that in the future. So you owe to the future, whereas the average Russian person owes much less, even though they might be living within their means at the current time. Now, violent crime, this one's debatable as well. There's a higher homicide rate in Russia, but there's a lower overall violent crime rate. So that would include things like assaults. Okay, so significantly less violent society, but there is a higher homicide rate. Now, where the US wins, and this is very important to note, is that the US has a higher life expectancy. They have a higher GDP, obviously. But as we've talked about, that's a lot of that is built around the dollar being the global reserve currency and them having the unlimited free reign to print as much money as they need. And so a lot of the economy is supported by that phony stimulus. Higher average income, higher level of energy consumption. Now this is good and bad, because it means that you are going to be dependent on that level of energy consumption in order to survive. If you have a lower energy consumption that you're accustomed to, it's going to be much easier when energy becomes scarce, which it likely never will in Russia because they have so much of it. But that's something to keep in mind, is that typically standard of living and energy consumption are well correlated, although the predictive relationship of that is not, it's just correlation. Civil rights, arguably, you have more civil rights in the United States. Certain minority groups can do things that they can't do in Russia, at least as far as I know. In terms of military power, the US, like I said, some people call the US a whale, whereas Russia is an elephant. So, it's like comparing a land-based military power to a naval and aviation-based military power. But generally speaking, with the exception of strategic nukes and the amounts of tanks and things of that nature, the US is more technologically superior, but arguably less resilient and robust in terms of, having a more analog style of military that doesn't need as much maintenance and energy inputs in order to sustain it. They have a slightly younger population. I believe the average age is around 38 compared to Russia's 40. They have obviously a technological advantage. It's the home of Silicon Valley and companies like Tesla and chip manufacturers, which can get down to a smaller nanometer than Russian chip manufacturers can. They do, of course, have lower inflation currently, even though realistically, it's probably greater inflation than Russia. And of course, if we see de-dollarization, then there could potentially be hyperinflation within the United States. And of course, they do have more formidable allies, we'll say, with NATO countries. So I just wanted to break that down for you guys, because I think a lot of people aren't aware of, if you're just looking at GDP, clearly the United States is the winner, because they're nearly 25 trillion GDP a year versus Russia, which is between 1 and 2 trillion a year. So you look at those two numbers and you might think, wow, the United States is far and away an order of magnitude more economically superior. But it's important to keep all these other things in mind. Now, a lot of this resource wealth requires infrastructure, it requires development. But just the simple fact that Russia has a fraction of the debt, I mean, we're talking like 1/100th of the debt that the USA has, or 2/100ths of the debt, we'll say, that the USA has, coupled with the fact that they have twice the amount of natural resources and the right kind of resources. So not just, resources that nobody needs, resources that everybody needs, as well as some of the rare earth metals that are going to be required to go green, to furnish the lithium-based renewable energy future. And of course, having strong ties with the Chinese is going to be another major determinant of who is going to come out the victor in the future. So what this looks like to me is that the United States is vastly more wealthy in terms of technology and human capital right now, but the real potential in the future lies with Russia. And one thing that this doesn't include also is the fact that now Russia has taken the Donbass, they've taken southern Ukraine. So if you incorporate all of those resources into this, then that even, of course, adds more population, adds more land, adds more resource wealth potentially. Let me know what you guys think in the comments section below. If you like this video, please like, comment, subscribe, and share it. I would greatly appreciate it. Thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Canadian Prepper out.